Let us look in more depth into the international covenants and our fundamental human rights and freedoms. Now let us look at the right to work. As we continue to look into our fundamental rights and freedoms, let us keep in mind that a right is something that can be exercised and never creates an obligation upon the one who has the ability to exercise it. Many of us do not make this association with the right, but it is important to understand the nature of what a right is. So a right, it doesn't produce an obligation, it produces an option. As you have seen, here in Canada, a citizen has the right to vote. As we just recently saw in the Canadian election for federal parliament, we have a right to vote. Now come election day, will Canada send some police officer to our home and say it's voting day, and you must go and you must use your right to vote? Of course not. Why? Because a right never produces an obligation, but an option to use it or not. So a right or freedom produces a choice. Can choose to use it, can choose not to use it. A right or freedom does not produce an obligation, cannot be forced to use the right. Looking into the International Covenant on Civil and on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 6, it states the following: the state parties to the present covenant, which includes Canada, recognize the right to work, which includes the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his living by work, which he freely chooses or accepts, and will take appropriate steps to safeguard this right. Now, this article of law is saying a lot, quite a bit, and if you're unfamiliar with law and fundamental freedoms, you could actually miss what's going on here. But let's start first of all with the player, or the subject, that's being brought forth here. Notice that here it says that the state parties recognize the right of everyone. That's the player, that's the subject, everyone. If you dig a bit deeper in law, you're going to find out that the word everyone, when we find it in the Constitution Act of Canada, or in the international covenants, it refers to the human being, or to the man or woman, the one who has the right to enjoy their economic, social, and cultural rights. So everyone here would mean the man or woman, the human being. Now, if you look into the International Covenant, whether on economic, social, and cultural rights, or the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 2, you're going to see where it talks about contributions, where it says that all people have the right of self-determination, and no people can be forced to make a contribution to the state party based upon the principle of mutual benefit. But they use the word or the designation of persons, people. And when they talk about it, they refer to the person or the people as an it, not as a he or she. So back into the International Covenant, we're looking at the player here, and the one being brought forth is not a person, it's not a people, but they specifically use the term or designation everyone. It says the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right to work, which includes the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his living by work. Now watch, which he, see that? Not it, which he freely chooses or accepts, and will take appropriate steps to safeguard this right. So this verse is saying that the right to work that is being used is something that a human being or a man or a woman freely chooses and accepts to do. And that right to work that you freely choose or accept to do, when you use that opportunity, it's to gain your living by work. You see, I'm going to read it again. Includes the right of everyone, the man or woman, the opportunity to gain his living by work, which he freely chooses or accepts. So when you go out there and you give your energy away to work, you are actually gaining your own living. You are providing for your own needs. What is expected of you is that you take that income that you make, you pay for your house, you pay for your clothing, you pay for your food, you pay for your hydro, you pay for your transportation. So what's actually transpiring is now you, as a person in this society, are producing your own living. And here the law is saying that you freely chose to do this. Now, the subject or player here is an everyone. The article of law did not use the designation of citizen or person, but specifically use the designation of everyone. This term everyone is bringing forth strictly the designation of a human being. This article of law is bringing forth a right that a human being has. A human being has the right to work. Now, my question is, does this produce an obligation? Is the law stating that a human being must work? No, it is not. Why? Because a right never produces an obligation, but a choice. Here we are seeing that as men and women, we have the right to work. Now, you go back up to the verse and it says, you freely choose or accept to work. Canada, as a state party, is under obligation as a signatory to the covenant to recognize the right to work. This is a right to work that an individual can choose to exercise, and as with any right, it can be used or not used, just like the right to vote. The right to work includes, now this means a canon of construction holding that to express or include one thing implies the exclusion of the other or the alternative, so what is about to be mentioned is the only reason for work. Remember, we learned that when the word includes is used in law, that whatever is about to be mentioned is the only explanation that can be used. The right to work includes the right of everyone, the human being, to the opportunity or the chance to gain his or her living by work. So you're seeing the reason for working is declared in law as strictly to gain a living by this work. If you choose to exercise the right to work, then the reason for working is to produce, earn, or gain a living. Gain the resources you need to live and survive, living for himself and his family, including food, clothing, and housing. The money and resources that you receive for working is to be used solely for the purpose of supplying your own living. This right to gain your living through work is something that you must freely choose or accept. This is what the law is stating in international law. Recognize the right to work, and you must freely choose or accept to work. The work is to earn and gain a living. The reason for working is specific. Canada must protect and ensure this right, and it remains a choice. This is not what transpired with our life, when we were never informed that work was a right that we could use. We were taught that work is an obligation and that we must work to survive or to have a living. We never freely chose to earn and gain a living, but were forced into gaining a living through being made ignorant of our fundamental rights and freedoms. We are seeing that we have the right to work, and since this is a right, it does not produce an obligation. We can choose to use this right, and if we do, then the purpose is strictly to produce a living. If we choose not to exercise this right, then what transpires? What is the consequence? Looking into the international covenants, we find another right that everyone, the human being, man or woman, has. International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 11. The states, parties to the present covenant, recognize the right of every person. Is that what it says? Recognizes the right of every citizen. No, that's not what it says, right? The subject or player that is being brought forth, again, is an everyone. And it says, recognizes the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. You and I, as individuals, have the right to an adequate standard of living. The standard of living does not need to be earned or gained. We do not have to exercise the right to work to have an adequate standard of living, but it is our natural right and freedom. You can choose to pursue after a living, or you can enjoy a living. In both options, the state party Canada was supposed to take appropriate steps to safeguard whatever right you decided to use. You decided. Now, to have a living is an obligation. Right to work, to earn and gain a living, the individual freely chooses to create their own living. Now, to have a living is an obligation. right to an adequate living, food, clothing, housing, continued improvement of this adequate living is the state party's obligation to every individual who chooses not to exercise their right to work. The state party, Canada, is designating you as a citizen and is automatically declaring that as a citizen, you must work to earn and gain a living. The right to choose if you will enjoy a living or if you will freely accept to earn and gain a living belongs solely to the human being, the man or the woman. Canada is declaring that you are a subject of the Queen and a citizen of the territory, and as such, they have declared that you have chosen to pursue a living. Since Canada is declaring that you are freely choosing to work, they have the obligation to take appropriate steps to safeguard this right on your behalf. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 6, it states the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right to work, which includes the right of everyone, see that, the opportunity to gain his living by work which he freely chooses or accepts, and will take appropriate steps to safeguard this right. Okay, so Canada, you recognize I have a right to work, and you're going to actually do something to protect my right to work. I don't have an obligation to use the right to work, but you're still going to take steps to protect this right. What are the steps you're going to take, Canada? The International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, Article 6.2. The steps to be taken by the state party to the present covenant to achieve the full realization of this right, the right to work, shall include technical and vocational guidance and training programs, policies and techniques to achieve steady economic, social, and cultural development. In order to help you as an individual fulfill the right to work that you freely accepted to use, or so the law is saying, Canada had to take steps to secure the education of a person who is operating the right to work. A person needs technical or vocational training in order to find a position in work. Canada was under obligation to provide this guidance and training to the individual. Canada recognizes the right to work, and they said they will take steps to safeguard this right. The steps to be taken will be technical and vocational training. It says the person freely accepts and chooses to work. International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 13.1. Now talking here about what education should be. The state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of every person, of every citizen. No, again, that's not what it's saying, right? Who's the player that's being brought forth here? The human being, the man and the woman. It says the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to education. They agree that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and the sense of its dignity, and shall strengthen the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. So basically what they're saying here is that education shall be primarily focused on teaching you what I am teaching you through this video, that education shall be focused on teaching you what are your fundamental rights and freedoms, and then further to that, they further agree that education shall enable all who? Persons to participate effectively in a free society. Remember, it says that everyone, the human being, freely accepts or chooses to use the right to work. Once you freely accept and choose the right to work, then you're participating in a free society. You've rendered yourself as that artificial being, that subject and servant of Her Majesty. You are now out there pursuing and earning a living. And they are saying that we need to give you an education in order for you to participate in this way of life. Now, this was supposed to be secondarily. First off, it was supposed to be if you are a human being and you decide not to use your right to work, then your education should be geared at your strengthening your understanding for human rights and fundamental freedoms. But since they force you to use your right to work, then they have the obligation to give you technical and vocational training. Education shall enable all persons to participate effectively in a free society. Technical and vocational training shall give the person the ability that it needs to work, to participate in a free society. The person freely chose or accepted to work. We all choose and accepted to work, accepted to be part of the society, That is why the law is saying it is a free society. So you see, in Article 13.1, they're stating here that the person is working in a free society and needs to be trained. And when we go back up to Article 6, it is talking about the fact that we freely choose. Oh, let me get up there. That we freely choose and accept to work. And that's not the case at all. We are being forced to use this right. Now, this education would have helped the person to exercise its right to work was to be free. If you look into the international covenants, it talks about the fact that the education that's to be obtained by the person should be free, and that they haven't fulfilled this obligation yet. Article 30. Canada had the obligation to teach you both designations under law, and then the choice was to be yours as to what rights you would choose to exercise. Canada did not allow you to decide and never taught you that you could have a living without having to gain that living, that you did not have to work for a living. The right to decide if you will freely choose and accept to work was a right that was recognized for a human being only. That is why the subject or player being brought forth in the article of law is everyone. The man or the woman had the right to decide if he or she would enjoy a living and pursue happiness, or decide to pursue and gain after a living. But Canada never allowed you to exercise that right. From early on, they forced your parents to send you to school. They said, if you do not send your children to school, we will take them away or we will fine you. What they were actually doing is they were forcing you to use your right to work, and they were preparing you through technical and vocational training, through education. International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 6. This states, parties to the present covenant recognize the right to work, which includes the right of everyone, the opportunity to gain his living by work which he freely chooses or accepts. When we are talking about the right to work, the reason for working was to produce a living. What we are talking about is the security of the person, the security of the individual, concerning the ability to have shelter from the elements, food to eat, and so forth, created through their work. This is dealing with the security of the individual. In the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, again in Article 11, it says the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone, the human being, the man or the woman, to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. If the human being, everyone, decided not to use their right to work, he or she still had the right to an adequate standard of living. This deals with the security of the person, the security of the human being. This obligation is directly against Her Majesty. It is she, which is the executive power here in Canada. It is she who is the sovereign of this land and who agreed to be signatory to the international covenants and the fundamental rights and freedoms contained in it. She owes the individual the debt obligation concerning an adequate living. This right to an adequate living exists only for a human being and not for an artificial entity. In order to fulfill the obligation, they must make provision exercisable by the human being. Now, when you look into the preamble of these international covenants, and the preamble always attempts to explain the reasons for the law, or the reasons for the enactments. The preamble of the covenants, the idea of free human beings enjoying, not pursuing, not going after, but enjoying freedom from fear and want, can only be achieved if conditions are created, something in the past that transpired, something that's already done, whereby everyone, the human being, may enjoy his economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as his civil and political rights. Now, this is important. I'm going to take a break and show you something once again. Here it talks about everyone. We know it's the human being. And what can he do? He has the right to enjoy his social and cultural rights, as well as his civil and political rights. If you enjoy something, it means you possess them already. It means you have them already. Couldn't find what I was looking for. I'll put it in another video another day. We'll keep on going. So the preamble of the covenant, let's get back there, says the idea of free human beings enjoying freedom from fear and want, can only be achieved if conditions are created, something in the past, again, whereby everyone may enjoy his economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as his civil and political rights. Enjoying means something you possess. Article 3. The state parties to the present covenant undertake to ensure the equal right of every person. No. Of every citizen. No. Of who? Of every man and woman to the enjoyment of all economic, social, and cultural rights set forth in the present covenant. As you begin to understand about fundamental rights and freedoms, you'll always see that men and women, human beings, have the right to enjoyment. And this enjoyment has been preserved through law. But the people, the citizen, the person, is always pursuing after their rights. We are seeing that there had to be conditions already created for a free human being to enjoy his or her rights and freedoms. There had to be conditions created, a system of law created that would fulfill the right to an adequate living, to provide the funds for that adequate living. The covenant talks about free human beings enjoying their rights through an already created system of law. It further states that the state parties had to ensure the enjoyment of these rights to men and women. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1. All peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, rights, privileges, and benefits. Now here, the peoples is referring to all the peoples of every state. That's why they're adding an S. Whether artificial or, if you will say, natural. That's why they're saying there and the, because they're including both. However, when you go deeper into the covenant and you combine these articles of law, you'll see that the one who's actually freely pursuing their economic, social, and cultural rights are not the men and women. The men and women are enjoying it. It's the person or the citizen that's been removed their fundamental rights, and now they're forced to pursue after it. Human beings, men and women, have the ability to enjoy their economic, social, and cultural rights. When operating as a people subject of Her Majesty, they must pursue after these and gain these rights. Now, looking into the Bank Act, which is a federal enactment, we find the following definition in the interpretation section. A debt obligation. So I look into the Bank Act, a federal enactment, and I look under the word debt obligation, and this is what it means. A debt obligation means a bond, debenture, note, or other evidence of indebtedness of an entity, whether secured or unsecured. A debt obligation means a bond, debenture, note, or other evidence of indebtedness of an entity. Now notice that it states a debt obligation is other evidence, but it fails to mention what such evidence is. It's left open. Now, debt obligation is other evidence of indebtedness. It's other evidence of a liability, an obligation of the entity. Now, in this Bank Act, an entity means a body corporate, a trust, a partnership, a fund, an unincorporated association or organization, Her Majesty in right of Canada, or of a province, an agency of Her Majesty in either such rights. Oh, so now I find out here in the Bank Act that the word entity means Her Majesty, and that the word debt means other types of indebtedness that this entity, Her Majesty, can have. Well, hang on. Her Majesty signed onto the international covenants, both of them. Her Majesty said that she said that she will allow individuals on her territory to have an adequate living if they don't exercise their right to work. Now I'm looking into the Bank Act and I'm seeing the fact that Her Majesty is an entity that owes a debt obligation. We see that when we are talking about a debt obligation, a security, within the context of the Bank Act, an entity can mean Her Majesty in the right of Canada directly. This is bringing forth and describing to us that a debt obligation can be owed by Her Majesty in the right of Canada. This debt obligation places Her Majesty into position of obligations and responsibility to perform her duties concerning the obligation. We know that Her Majesty in right of Canada, through her executive powers, became a signatory to the international covenants. and thereby became accountable to respect and ensure all the fundamental rights and freedoms contained in the covenant. This is where the debt obligation is arising against Her Majesty. It's concerning our adequate living, or our right to enjoy a living and not pursue after a living. Her Majesty is accountable to the covenants. The covenants produce a debt obligation, create conditions to enjoy a living, food, clothing, housing, improved conditions. She is an entity that owes us an obligation. Now, isn't it funny that when you look into the word person in the Bank Act, you'll find a redefinition of the word. Person in the Bank Act means a natural person, an entity, or a personal representative. So, as a human being, we can claim to be a natural person. Don't ever think that a natural person and a human being are one and the same. They'll catch you in law if you try that. But as a human being, you can step in and play the role of a natural person. And as a natural person, you can invoke the adequate living that Her Majesty has towards you. You can invoke the obligation that she has towards the adequate living. The word person in the Bank Act has been redefined. As you see above, it now has the definition to include the natural person. You would expect to see this transpire within this enactment, because remember, Her Majesty only has an obligation towards us as a human being. The right to enjoy a living and to have an adequate living is for the human being. And when we are talking about a debt obligation that Her Majesty owes, it is to the human being that she owes it to. That is why the redefinition of the word has taken place. You see, natural person can be charged. That entity can be charged with the rights and duties and obligations of a human being. That's why it's being redefined here. Now it goes further. In the Bank Act Article 83, look at what a security is. A security is in registered form if it specifies a person entitled to the security or to the rights it evidences, or B, it bears a statement that it is in registered form. Well, go and check your birth certificate and go and check your live registration of birth and see if it does not bear a statement that it is in registered form. A security is in registered form if it bears a statement upon it that it is in registered form. If you look upon the document that we are given or received from the government after a human being is born, it is designated a registration of live birth. Written upon the documentation, it is indicated that it is indeed registered, meaning it is in registered form. Now, I looked a little bit deeper into the Bank Act and said, okay, if Her Majesty is an entity that owes a debt obligation, and I'm seeing that a security is in registered form, if it says it's in registered form, what about the obligation? I know that she owes me the obligation to an adequate living based upon the international covenants, based upon the fact if I don't exercise my right to work, then she has the obligation to provide that living for me based upon the resources of this land here in Canada. But look what the Bank Act says. Status of a guarantor. A guarantor for an issuer of a security is deemed to be an issuer to the extent of the guarantee, whether or not the guarantor's obligation is noted on the security. So even if what she owes you, even if the obligation of what is owed, what that security, that registered security represents is not indicated upon it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that she's still the guarantor. It doesn't change the fact that she's still the entity that owes you the debt obligation of the adequate living, even though it may not be written upon your registered document, which is your birth certificate or your live registration of birth. In this case, for the human being, for their man or woman, because you're seeking to exercise the right to an adequate living, it would be your live registration of birth. That's where the obligation would attach upon. This security is a representation of the obligation, the debt obligation that Her Majesty has towards the human being. The obligation to make sure that the human being has an adequate living, including food, clothing, and housing, and to the continued improvement of living conditions. This security is issued to the natural person, i.e. the human being, and creates or represents the obligation, even though it is not written upon the security itself as to what the obligations are. The law says it does not have to be stipulated or written on the security. The registration of a live birth is indicating the birth of a child. This document indicates that there was a birth of a child. We know that a child-in-law is a minor, is not capable, is not able to handle his finances, and must be looked after. In the Bank Act, it states that the bank may treat a person as a registered security holder who's entitled to exercise all the rights of the security of the holder if the person presents to the bank a certain piece of evidence. So our mom and our dad registered our birth, right, with the government. We got a copy of it, whether our live registration of birth or whether our birth certificate. We got a copy of it, but it was registered with the government, and they are the ones who are holding the official documents. Now, they are the constructive registered holder. Now look what it says. Notwithstanding subsection 1, a bank may treat a person as a registered security holder entitled to exercise all of the rights of the security holder that the person represents if the person provides the bank with evidence as described in subsection 127.4 that the person is B. The personal representative of a registered security holder who is a minor, an incompetent person, or a missing person. A child is born, a debt obligation is produced. The registration of a live birth, registration of the debt obligation. You understand? Your parents register your live birth, now the debt obligation forms against Her Majesty. You've got to provide this little one an adequate living. You're declared to be minors. The constructive registered holder seizes control of your security. We are their owner, but we have no control. Further to that, this dude who's been placed over our security then decides you're going to use your right to work. You understand? They make the decision for you. You're going to use your right to work, and by doing so, we're not going to provide funds for you, and then we're going to force you to go to school to get technical and vocational training. The ministers, agents of Her Majesty, are the persons who are exercising the rights to the security. When you look on the security itself, it indicates a minor. The agents of Her Majesty have every right to operate upon the security because they are designating us a minor. So if you go and look on your live registration of birth, your live registration of birth that you have, look at what they declare where your name is. They say that you are a child. That's what they're declaring. This is a registered document, and it's declaring that you are a child. Therefore, you are a minor. Therefore, you cannot exercise the rights that this security entitles you to. They put the constructive registered holder upon it. He exercises the rights, even though he's not the owner, and then he decides you will use your right to work and removes your patrimony from you. The claim of recognition that you sent to the government executive body has informed them that you are no longer a minor and that you wish to be recognized as a human being. This is bringing forth back the debt obligation that Her Majesty has towards you. Now, the Bank Act goes even deeper to protect all that's going on here. If you look, it says dealings with a registered owner. A bank or trustee, within the meaning of subsection 294, may treat the registered owner of the security as the person exclusively entitled to vote, to receive notices, to receive any interest, dividend, or other payment in respect of the security, and to exercise all the rights and powers of an owner of the security. A trustee is treated as the owner of the security. The trustee declares that we are minors and then exercises the rights to the security. The bank treats the trustee as a person exclusively entitled to hold, to receive notices, to receive any interest, dividend, or other payment in respect of the security, and to exercise all of the rights and powers of the owner, that being me and you, of the security, even though they are not the owner of the security. The bank or trustee treats the registered owner as entitled to vote, receive payments, interest, dividends, or other payments, even though they are not the owner of the security, but have all the rights and privileges to the security. Now, immunity of the bank. A bank is not required to inquire into the existence of or see to the performance or observance of any duty owed to a third person by a registered holder of any of its securities, or by anyone whom it treats as permitted or required by this part as the owner or registered holder thereof. That is disgusting when you understand what's transpiring. The Bank of Canada, is not required to verify, check into the existence, or see to the performance of any duty owed to a third person by the registered holder of the security. The Minister declares that he is operating as a constructive registered holder on the security and that he is entitled to all the benefits of that security. The bank does not have to verify the legal obligation. I know this sounds ridiculous, but it is the way that they placed this into the law in order to operate upon the security without ever having to check it. There is no liability on the Minister of the Bank of Canada or any agent of the bank for allowing other ministers to operate upon the security. It is only us, the owners of the security, that can do anything about the situation. So this debt obligation that Her Majesty owes us is for the adequate living. And you can't hope to even exercise that right to an adequate living and to have Her Majesty accountable to you without first breaking the, if you will say, the hold that they have on your life concerning your right to work. You have to be mentioning or bringing forth the fact that, listen, you forced me to use my right to work. You never forced me to use my right to vote, but yet you forced me to use my right to work. And in doing so, you took away my right to an adequate living. And you made me be part of this commercial society.